My name is Michaela Madrid with the Sovereign Bodies Institute. And before we kick off our webinar today, I'd like to welcome our panelist, Greg Greycloud, to start us off with a prayer.
Good morning. Am I on?
No, we can't see you. There you are.
Okay. Ho mitakia pi peshuto obgage na wahokiza nata mielo. I'll offer a prayer for us. I'll offer it in the form of a song that calls out to the grandfather, to a creator, to hear us, to take pity upon us and help us with some things that we find that are difficult in our lives, but primarily to hear our voices when we call out. So I think in that way, when addressing domestic and sexual violence against men and boys in our communities, we're asking for help and we're calling out to the creator for help. So if you will. Tonka shila namahu Oshia che chielo Ao namahu hai Namahu Oshia che chielo Ao namahu hai o
Oh,
Thank you very much, Greg, for opening us up in a good way for this really important conversation. Like I said earlier, I'm with the Sovereign Bodies Institute, and we are really honored today to host this important conversation as part of our Domestic Violence Awareness Month webinar series. So this panel today is going to be moderated by our very own Lenny Hayes. And so from here, I'll pass it off. Thank you.
thank you, Michaela. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lenny Hayes, English name. My spirit name is Tukawanaki Luta, Redstone Ghost, and I come from the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate of the northeast corner of South Dakota. I am the missing and murdered Two-Spirit project assistant for Sovereign Bodies, and I am very excited today about this conversation that we're going to be having today. I'd like to apologize that our other panelists are not here. Hopefully they'll still be able to come in and help with this conversation. If not, I'm very happy that Greg has agreed to be here, and I know Greg has done a lot of good work in his community in regards to addressing domestic and sexual violence on men and boys in his community. So I'm very proud of the work that he's doing. So with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Greg some questions. So one of the questions that so what I'm going to do now is I'd like to do, like Greg, for you to do an introduction of who you are, where are you located, and to talk a little bit about the work that you do within your community.
Okay, now we're back. It seems to be a little bit blurry on my end. I don't know if it is on your guys' end, but hello, people. Hello, my relatives, friends. My name is Greg Greycloud. I'm the co-founder of We Chaw Ugly. I'm an enrolled member of the Crow Creek Sioux Tribe, and that's located central South Dakota, right on the Big Bend of the Missouri River. I live in Mission, South Dakota, which is on the Sichongumakoche, the Rosebud Reservation. I've been living here since 2011, where we founded We Chaw Ugly to Returning Man. We're a Native Men Against Domestic and Sexual Violence organization, a primarily Native men organization, working towards ending violence against women. by finding the root of violence with convicted violent perpetrators, violent offenders, finding the root of violence and helping them heal from their childhood trauma, and then learning better and healthier behaviors going forward out of the class. And we run a extensive class right now. During COVID, it's been hard to have in-person classes and meetings, and we're still kind of dealing with kind of how to figure out how to do men's classes while taking the precautions of due to COVID-19. But we have a 6-month long class for men that is very hard to complete for a man coming into the program. We have a low graduate rate, but we do have with them graduates, non-reoffenders. We've learned that going through the classes that once they do graduate, they learn to be better men, healthier men, better fathers, better partners, and better providers for their families.
Thank you, Greg. Sounds like you're doing some amazing work. One of the things that I want to remind the audience is that that if there's anything that may be said within this panel discussion, I want to remind people to take care of themselves. Please use our medicines to take care of yourself. If you need to step away from your screen for a few minutes, that's okay too. Because we know that this is a topic that we normally don't talk about within our tribal communities, talking about sexual and domestic violence against men and boys. But one of the things that I'm always saying about our communities is that, you know, as Indian people, we're always talking about that our communities need to heal. But one of the things that I always talk about is the fact that if we want our community to heal, that healing involves all genders. And we know that it's been very difficult in regards to creating a safe space for men to heal, men and boys. So that's always been in my work. That's one of the things that I'm always stressing is just that creation of safety, because we could never force people to come forward and tell their stories. But what we want to do is just create that safe space so that they can tell their stories. You know, and we hear this all the time. That we need our men, we need our boys to step up. But my response to that is always is that if you want our boys and men to step up, if you want them to be warriors, how can they do that if we haven't created a space for them to heal? So that's one of the things that I always like to say within our communities when I go out and do work in our communities. So with that, if we're not able to go through all of these questions, this may turn into more of a discussion between me and Greg, which is fine too. There's no really a wrong or right way of doing this, but we just want to impose that it's important that we begin to start to have these conversations within our tribal communities in order to create a safe space. So I'm going to ask you a question, Greg. In your work addressing sexual and domestic violence against men and boys, what has been one of your biggest challenges and how did you address it?
My biggest challenge personally in doing classes and work with men, we've done work in the jail here on the Rosebud Reservation. We do the private classes and things, and even with the boys from grade 6 to grade 12. But more importantly, in the classes with men, one of the biggest challenges was that I seen myself in a lot of the men coming through the classes and that sat in the classroom and them sharing their stories. One of the biggest things for me when I very first started was reflecting on I used to be that man. I used to be that man. I used to be these people. And I related to all of them. And that was one of my biggest challenges was when I related to them, I wouldn't show it, but I would grow a little uncomfortable with myself. And so, and I think that kind of would start to affect the way I facilitated. Um, and it was only, like I said, towards the beginning, and it was that way because, like I said, I would get afraid and I would feel uncomfortable. Um, for even feeling or believing that that was once a belief of mine that I related to the men, and it was always a negative belief, and it came from trauma. Whether it be, how do you respond to your partner asking you about such and such, or how do you respond to your partner explaining something to you, or presenting a conflict to you, or those types of things where it was difficult for me to really, I suppose, understand. And then, and so how do I address that is, as I found my journey of healing. I started to heal, and I found where I needed to start. And that was one of the most influential things that happened was me healing in my journey and finding myself in my healing journey along the way. And that allowed for us to facilitate with men and boys and children, and relate to them and really create some really growing strength and potential of finding healing for the young boys and the men that we worked with. And but the biggest struggle was healing, I think, in this type of work, because once we found healing in our personal healing and growth, then we looked at things as it was an attack. It wasn't an attack onto us personally, but it was because somebody else was hurt. And so we really found different ways to navigate around responses, negative responses with men and boys. We found out healthier ways and easier ways to navigate around the conversation. And by using emotions, a lot of times we as men are afraid of emotions and we're confused by them and we don't understand them. And I think that's a stigma as well, because it
Mm-hmm.
wasn't taught to us as men growing up, our boys growing up. But I do believe that that was the most struggle I've seen that we have as a young organization and as young men. Heck, I'm only barely in my 30s, and when we first started this work, I was mid 20s, and I was just a boy looking to be a man.
Mm-hmm. So I've seen your work and have been really pleased with the work that you have done out in communities nationally. So one of the questions that or one of the topics that we really don't talk about within our Native community is like masculinity. I know that you do some really good work in talking about toxic masculinity. Can you share with us your thoughts on that?
Toxic masculinity.
Yes.
So toxic masculinity, what I found that really is helpful for men to understand what that means, because masculinity shouldn't be a bad thing, right? To be
Mm-hmm.
masculine, it shouldn't be a bad thing, or to be not masculine shouldn't be a bad thing either. But I think where we get confused is masculinity that men have naturally, um, is okay, and men automatically think that because the unhealthy behaviors we learned as children growing up, we accentuate them and we push them out to a more powerful or a more power and control. Sorry, the format that becomes toxic, and a lot of the men, that understand masculinity to not be a bad thing. This might not be about you, but a lot of times when young boys grow up without a healthy male figure in our lives, we learn unhealthy behaviors because we're little boys trying to learn how to be men and we don't know how. And so we figure out ways that we can utilize power and control to make our own reality. more comfortable for us. And a lot of times that looks like men raising their voices, using power and control, isolation, emotional abuse, a lot of times it will lead and end, will lead to those types of dynamics. And toxic masculinity is where we take our forced beliefs into a situation to control it, and where it becomes real toxic. And I'm using toxic to explain what toxic means. But a lot of times we'll take our unhealthy behaviors and use our forced beliefs to control a situation.
Thank you. Well, I know that that you do some awesome talking circles with men. I've seen it, and I believe that's such amazing work. And I love how you can break down all those barriers that prevent men from being able to just show a little bit of their feelings. So, and it makes me really happy that you're able to connect in that way to create a space for men to be okay with that. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, and I really like the work that you do. So in your work addressing sexual and domestic violence against men and boys, one of the things that that I'd like to ask you is, what are you doing in your community for men who are stigmatized as abusers, but in reality are the ones who are being abused?
Oh, that's a very good question.
Mm-hmm.
And we found in the work that we've done here on the Rosebud community, and I really hope that it relates to those who are not in this community and who are all over. Maybe they're listening and watching and tuned in. We have had men who weren't the violent perpetrators, but took the plea. They took the charge as a plea to get out of jail and to lower their fines and costs and things. And so they took the class as a way to get out. And they really didn't. They would come into the class saying that it wasn't me, I didn't really do it. But of course, this comes from a lot of the men, and identify the behaviors that the men that do come in show, and we will recognize and pick the difference between the men who are the men who do use power and control tactics, men who really weren't the perpetrators, but we will teach them the same things as we teach a violent perpetrator. So that way, we can identify violence. We can identify those types of behaviors. We can identify why one would want to use those types of behaviors against their partner. And the men who are stigmatized as abusers and who are not, they learn. So I talk about it in the class that you will learn violence in every part of the way and every part of the form of violence, between sexual, physical, and breaking it down, and using children, financial abuse, coercion. And so they'll learn violence and what that looks like exactly, and they'll learn the intent. And we break it down and what was the intent of the violence, what was their beliefs, what was the feelings that were had at that time. And even the men who come into the class who were not originally the violent perpetrators, but were convicted of a violent crime, they will begin learning. They will begin understanding why maybe their partners are that way, or use violence against them. And most of the time, it boils down to the root of their violence is childhood trauma.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is the root of it all, folks. I mean, the root of violence in our communities right now is our childhood trauma. Things that we learned or did not learn, or things that happened or did not happen to us as children. And a lot of people will think that, well, we got to put it behind us and move forward, where it's really hard to move forward from a sexual assault. It's really hard to move forward from being raped. It's really hard to move forward from being beaten as a child and staying that age for so long. So we look at the childhood trauma from the men who come into the community or come into the class who weren't the original abusers. They will say, well, in their past relationship, the reason why I don't do anything or I'm not loud with my partner and I let her do this to me is because in her previous relationship, she was abused and some really messed up things happened to her. And so they're trying not to behave in a manner where in return, there's a type of thing that happens, and I think that's a different conversation, where women will begin to protect themselves or fight back, and fight back towards somebody who might not even be perpetrating against them, but already their partners won't have that trust towards men. They don't have a trust or feel safe around men. And so the only way they know how to feel safe is become louder or bigger or stronger or more intimidating than their partner. And that will lead to domestic violence. That will lead to abusing. And so the men will come into the class with that type of behavior, with their tail tucked between their legs and learn. They'll come in and learn how to we always tell that to the men in the class. Should you come into the class with uh, being toxic and with showing toxic masculinity, with body language and emotions and feelings that want to hurt us, and so I will not allow you into this class. But if you want to come into this class as a way to learn, we will feed you. We will be your relative and we'll help you learn. Um, and so the men coming into the class, whether they're a violent perpetrator, they were convicted of domestic violence and they are guilty of it, and whether they be not guilty of it, they will learn the same thing on a different spectrum. So the men who are not guilty of it, the men who are, they meet in the middle and they pick each other up and they help each other more. And I've learned that the men who are stigmatized as abusers and who weren't guilty of it will feel a lot more supportive and actually become leaders for the men who are abusers in the class. They will become like, I've seen them become the example. I've seen them become, I think it's because the men who are guilty of domestic violence, they see themselves like, geez, do I treat my partner? Do I make this is the way that so the men will come in as a representation of a woman. Like that's their mannerisms, their behaviors. They're acting like they've been abused. Um, and so the men will start to see that and reconcile. They'll begin reconciling. So when men come together in a group setting, we're emotional beings. Men will share a lot of emotions. Why? Because they see and they relate and they're able to relate with all the men that are sitting around them and not feel afraid. And like you said, Lenny, like you're really great at doing is creating a safe space for anybody to share. Um, I think that I've been guided down a path to where I'm able to create a safe space for a certain uh, type of people to share, or a certain place for people to share. I guess a demographic would be men who are victims of sexual assault, and there's teachings that I've learned and how to address conversation with that. I think that's one way that we can create that type of conversation to continue instead of battle against each other, abusers versus non-abusers.
Mm-hmm. And I think, what makes it very difficult too is that the men who are being abused carry so much shame. It really impacts their masculinity. It really impacts who they are as men. And so often because of that, it makes it difficult for men to come forward to say, I am being abused, So I'm really happy to hear that you guys are touching on that as part of your work, which is, I believe we need to hear that more in our tribal communities, that there are men who are being abused, you know. And when we talk about abuse, one of the things I always say is that, abuse of any form, sexual, domestic, we know it happens in all communities. But again, today we're specifically talking about tribal communities because we just don't have this conversation, right? So I'm really happy that we're having this conversation. Um, so I want to get into talking a little bit about sexual violence. We touched on domestic violence. I want to talk about sexual violence. Um, so when you have conversation with men about sexual violence that may have happened to them, what is your approach in having that conversation? I know it's like creating a safe space. I know that you do equine therapy, and I imagine the horses become very helpful in this work just because of, you know, our cultural beliefs in, you know, of horses, that horses are medicine. So can you describe to us some of that work that you do when it comes to equine therapy?
Mhm. So and it's just like that, like how we stepped into talking about sexual abuse. There's stages. So when a man comes into the program, it is I do not recommend it to ask a man straightforward if he's ever been sexually assaulted and get closer to get into his bubble and make him feel really uncomfortable. And it's a gradual process of a
Mhm.
conversation that happens. And so, kind of like that process and how we take is yes, we utilize horses. We utilize horses and we chaw ugly to have this type of conversation, but we have had this type of conversation without horses. It's much easier to have it with a horse present. But in doing, to get there, we use we use a way of storytelling that has nothing to do with anybody personally. It has uh, well, we tell stories in third person, and when we tell stories in third person, the main character of the story's name is Hokshila. Now Hokshila went through many things in his life, and so we'll start to talk about stories and the small violences, not small violences, but the not so extreme violences that been perpetrated against Hokshila. And a lot of times, them stories are stories of myself, of brother Aldo, brother Jeremy, and we get together and we've shared our traumas with each other, and so we learned different ways to tell stories to connect to men. Because, like you said, stories, our traumas are all different, and so whether it be I'd be talking about Jeremy as a little boy, or Aldo as a little boy, or myself as a little boy, Hulk Shilau has been through many things.
Mhm.
And so we start telling the story of Hochschila and how things will get worse for Hochschila. And in every story, in every situation, the men begin to understand that they are Hochschila. They are Hochschila. And in Lakota, in our language, Hochschila means boy. And so they'll start to learn that they are Hochschila, and that Hochschila has gone through a lot of stuff on his own and doing things and things that happened to him. And then we get into deeper, more rooted or violent trauma, such as sexual assault and abuse and molestation and rape as children. And Hochschila has seen all of that, and Hochschila has experienced that. And so this boy, being that he's a survivor of so many types of violences, these men will look into these stories and almost become that little boy. And then at the end of the stories and introducing Hochschila and his sexual assaults, um, the men feel vulnerable. And there's one of two things that usually happen. So the men that are vulnerable, that are listening to the stories, will choose to shut down and just be quiet and wait their turn. And then the other way is the men will admit, they'll admit that they're like Hokshila. They won't say that I was sexually assaulted. They'll say, I like Hokshila. Hokshila is like me. And I'm like him. And then the conversation goes from there. Well, if you seen Hochschila, what would you do to him? What would you say to him? And these men say, man, I just give Hochschila a hug. And that alone, geez, get my eyes like that already. But when the man will say, I just want to give Hochschila a hug, that will tell us that they've experienced that type of trauma as well. That Hochschila is experiencing. And so when we guide in third person, we guide these men down a path of a boy searching to become a man. These boys really, the men they'll become boys again. And you can see their spirit. They turn into little boys, whether they be afraid and closed down or they're interested in what you have to say. Men will turn into boys, will turn into children and listen. Uh, and it's really important at this time that we don't insert, as facilitators, that we don't insert our own emotions on there, onto those stories and become and make it about ourselves because we're trying to open it up for these men.
Yep.
And when they're really, the men, we found that when the men become an innocent little boy, they really begin to grow from when they first experienced trauma, say they were 7, 8, 9 years old, they become that, and then really fast and swiftly they start becoming older. They'll start growing. And you can see it. They start to mature in their faces and their behaviors and mannerisms, and they're a little bit more respectful, and they're like sponges then. These men will turn to boys and they'll become sponges, and everything that you share with them and you guide them towards that just becomes a real beautiful and special thing. And so when talking about sexual assault with men and how we guide those conversations is we do it in third person and do not insert ourselves. I wouldn't tell my story as me. This is what happened to me, boys. And the boys will just feel bad for me. They won't relate. They'll say he needs to talk about it, or they'll grow tired and not listen.
Mm-hmm.
Or when we be making about something that's third person, a boy that I call Hoshila, and they'll begin to relate, hurt, cry, learn, and grow and heal.
Mm-hmm. You know, I've always enjoyed you and I's conversations that we would have specifically on this topic. And being a survivor myself, you know, I just love how you integrate, you know, Hochschila into work that you do and Hochschila within yourself. Because, you know, that's one of my concepts as a mental and chemical health provider is when working with Native people is to get them to get in touch with that child within, because that child is the one who's being impacted.
Yeah.
And, you know, and having this conversation, you know, I want to make it clear to the audience that we are not trying to not keep men accountable who are abusers. What we're trying to do is to help people to understand them. It doesn't take away the violence. That's not what we're trying to do. But in order for us to heal, also, we need to understand. Because one of the things that I always say is that we don't wake up one day and say, oh, I think I'm going to be a perpetrator. Something happened to them. You know, either it was perpetrated on them or maybe it's something they seen. So, Greg, we got a question from the audience in regards to your work. And it's from Jessica. Greg says, she says, Greg, your work is powerful. How would you suggest someone start programs like yours within our own tribal communities?
That's a great question, Jessica. It's a difficult program to start because one has to be trusted community. One has to be trusted by their community. One has to be accountable to their community. And a lot of times, brothers out there, there's a lot of good men. There's good men out there. I know that. But a lot of times, sometimes we as men don't like to always listen to a woman. that you don't always like to listen to a woman, and we have to learn how to address that within ourselves, and be accountable. So oftentimes when we first started this work, when we be in a community, we'd encourage our tweens, our tweepy, our aunties. We'd encourage them to or do us out or correct us, even if it's in public. Should we do anything wrong or that upsets you, we think that is mannerisms and behaviors that you got to give the women the permission to be up, so you're accountable to them and correct you even in public. And sometimes it feels like shameful, but when you get past that, it's not just about you, it's about growing and being an example for maybe the people who hear or see that happen. And the one has to be really trusted and accountable to its community. Then we started working with the local domestic violence shelter here in our community. Um, we started working with them and helping with programming with them, and it started as an initiative. So just start an initiative in your community with a local program. And we went with domestic violence shelter, White Buffalo Cap Women's Society, because at the time, Janet Routson, she was she's a former executive director of domestic violence shelter, White Buffalo Cap Women's Society. She was like an auntie. She was she is a really great auntie. And she would be that one to correct us even in a public setting, not to shame us out or make us feel any kind of bad or feel less than her or she's above us, even though she is as a matriarch. She would help us, and so you have to work together with that, men and women, be an example in the community to create cohesive understandings, and even in conflict, even in a situation where there's a lot of conflict or friction or it's a conversation that's uncomfortable, we have to be accountable to that. And then we grew with the domestic violence shelter, and it was less an initiative and more of a dream that we were facilitating. But we got involved with that shelter. Like I said, the steps is accountability, community organizing, and then organizing as a program, getting together, finding your vision and finding your goals and meeting those, and what is something that you would like to do, no matter if it be domestic violence prevention work, whether it be sexual prevention work, is go one and then with each other, or whether it be suicide, whatever issues that our people face, find something, stick to it. And how can you help and create an initiative, but be able and willing to um, accept other opinions, but continue to do the footwork. It has to be done by people doing the footwork on the ground. And it was very difficult. Brother Aldo and I, we volunteered the first 4 years, and I'm not saying that that's a recommendation, but we volunteered the first 4 years of our programming and trying to create it just to give back to the community. And it was supported by the community, and it was something very beautiful that just fell into place because the community wanted it. So things that are forced, like if you're trying to do something and you can't get nobody to help or participate, maybe we change our approach. Maybe we find healing first before we move forward with things. And then accountability was the biggest one, the biggest thing to get involved in your own community. Being accountable, find somebody who's trusted and is accountable, and who's teachable. Find somebody who's teachable, not somebody already set in their ways, kind of like the old gelding horses that we work with. When they're older and set in their ways, it's really hard to train them. But when we get a younger horse who's wanting to learn and who wants to take direction, the training comes easy after that. Mhm.
So I mean, it's really important. What I'm hearing is that in this work that we're doing as males, that the work should be led by us, right? Um,
You know?
With the recommendation of like reaching out to our aunties within our communities, you know, to get their input.
Right. There has to be that female presence or that female frame of mind that we're directed by, kind of like a son getting directed by his mother to do things, to finish duties of a man. Right.
Yep,
I do think that the conversation with violent perpetrators and men who are abusers needs to come from a man to men.
I like that.
But with the ideology and belief and framework and the matriarchs behind that word, behind that voice that's supporting that voice. Yes, I truly
Yes.
believe that.
Thank you. I mean, I totally agree with you too, because even like, you know, as long as I've been doing the work that I do, you know, not only to address, you know, sexual violence and domestic violence against men and boys, but the reality of violence that's against two-spirit people. Um, and so I look upon a lot of the women who have taught me from the different coalitions, you know, like Nicole Matthews, Linda Thompson, all of those aunties, Sandy
Oh
Burser,
yeah.
all of them, you know, I go to them with questions. I get advice from them. So, you know, I believe that's also important. But there's also one of the things I want to touch on quickly. Well, not quickly, but to have a little bit conversation about in regards to individuals who may identify as two-spirit, bisexual, or gay, however these males identify themselves. Um, what is your recommendations about, or what is your suggestions about working with this population? And have you had an individual in your community that has come forward to say, I need, you know, some support, I need some work? How have you worked with them? If you have.
Yep. We have had a man in our program who we found out was the one being abused. But he was in our class, and he was two spirit. He was a very interesting character, a very interesting character, and without involving him too personally and too close to that, his beliefs were the same as mine. His beliefs were the same as mine. His trauma was very similar to ours. His trauma was very similar to ours, and his pain and struggle was very similar to ours. Um, but he's seen something a little different because he was different growing up, and it was something that he did not understand, and he was bullied because people called him gay. People called him all kinds of other names that were very hurtful. But his beliefs were the same as mine in in having a non-violent relationship. And but he did have a rage that was also the same as mine, and the same as the guys in the class, and were they all related? So when the men, because they knew who he was, of course, he was known in the community. But when the men looked at that, the only difference is who they choose to have for their partners. That everything else was the same for them. And understanding and creating a safe place for him in the men in the class of violent perpetrators, of men who are very toxic in their masculinity and power and control, and seen it a very certain way, and it was concrete, and there was no other excuses or explanations, and you cannot be anything different than us. um, we learned that the men became already, they were emotional because we're talking about things in our own traumas. And I don't know if there was a different way I could have handled that, or we could have handled that, or I don't know if we maybe could have addressed him and his being in the LGBT community, being gay. There wasn't anything that we did different with him other than understanding him. I think is a little different when understanding a man who's been sexually assaulted and who is not gay, and understanding a man who is sexually assaulted and is gay. I think just understanding them is a little different. I think that's where, but it's hard as a facilitator to differentiate those understandings and still be able to control the conversation forward. Um, and it's something that I can't necessarily explain, that maybe could be better explained by one of the other co-founders of We Chaw Ugly. But it was the situation in itself was I had to find a different way to understand him than I found a way to understand another man.
So what I'm hearing, what you're saying is that it's important when doing this work that we check our own biases.
Yes.
Because one of the things that I always say, because I do identify as a two-spirit male, I identify as a Winkta, which was the word that was given to me by my people.
Mm.
But one of the things that I will say to people is that I am a male. I am a male who was impacted by sexual violence. And so my identity has nothing to do with that.
Yeah.
And
Uh,
I think that's really important that, by saying that we're also creating a space for males who identify to come forward and to be able to work through their trauma.
mhm.
So I'm really glad you said that. It's amazing. I mean, we learn as we go, because this population has been shunned, you know, for a very long time, and it's happening across our tribal communities across the country. So I'm glad to hear that. But one of the things, and then I wanted to sort of bring up a conversation that me and you had several months back, which is a really important question or important conversation that we need to have within our families, within our communities, within our organizations that work specifically with men. But you and I had a conversation that was very powerful in regards to we know that when a male is either a boy or a young male or a male, if they're being raped, we don't talk about what happens to the body. Often sometimes when a male is being raped, they will often get an erection and they will often ejaculate through the process, which leads to a lot of confusion
Mhm.
because they say, well, I must have enjoyed it. Why did this happen? I must be gay, you know. So we don't have a lot of conversation about the development of our bodies, and like things happen like that when we are being aroused. And it's not an arousal that's positive, it's an arousal that's negative.
Mhm.
So do you have that conversation with some of the males that you work with?
Um, we have had, so to answer that in all honesty, we have had that conversation with men, and not maybe as intricate as a conversation that you and I
Yeah.
had. But because we've had that conversation because there is like a stimulation that happens, right? But it's a forced stimulation that happens.
Yep.
And it is something that brings confusion. And I think there's a lot of hierarchy in men that have said, well, if she was raped or they were raped and they orgasm, then they must have liked it. It's very false. Being gay does not come from a sexual assault. It is not a result of being sexually assaulted. There is a forced response that the body has when one is sexually assaulted, when something is forced upon them. And there
Hmm.
are very many sensations and feelings that one feels, and it's all oftentimes a forced feeling. Maybe, maybe, maybe if people don't know, can't relate with that. Maybe if they don't understand being sexually assaulted because they haven't been, and I pray that you never are. But and I'm not saying it's the same, but maybe a type of way you can understand that is from being strangled or choked. When you create that force on the throat, you start to lose sensation and feelings. And then we start to gain other ones like tingly and feeling light and freaked out and lightheaded. You feel numb. There's other things that you feel from that the strangling and choking that you can't stop or you don't have any control of, but it's your body shutting down and creating other ways for it to try to survive or continue being a body.
Mm-hmm.
And it tries to make things easier for yourself. So your body's constantly adapting to things. And when dealing with things such as a sexual assault, your body will force itself to behave a certain way to try to overcome something to protect itself.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do think that's where that comes from. And I do believe strongly that uh, uh, being gay is not a result of sexual assault. And having those types of feelings and what people believe is not a result of that.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. So I'm going to ask you a question. What would be some of your recommendations to help address the issues of sexual violence against men and boys? What are some of your recommendations? Example, like funding, programming, men as leaders of the work, two-spirit or gay or bisexual males, etc. So what would be some of your recommendations to help address the issues of sexual violence against men and boys?
Number one recommendation for addressing and creating more conversation or to help address the issues of sexual violence against men and boys is funding.
Mm-hmm.
It's the number one problem that we have had and that we have faced and that we have found that the biggest problem that we have in trying to create programming is funding. And there's no funding for men in this work to address violence against men and boys. Um, there's no all the funding that we had wrote in to OVW and they said contact your local domestic violence shelter. They can disperse funds however they want to for addressing those. And we got that response was just that's taking more resources away from women that very much need those resources in order to be provided a protective sanctuary or protective space or even a protective four walls to feel protected. So that's the number one, and that would be my recommendation is if there can be delegated funding sources for men doing this type of work, that would mean the world to not just the boys that we're working for, not just the men who are the facilitators and doing the programming, but for the women who are being taken, stripped away resources right now all over the country. Wherever there are men also helping for the work, helping do this type of work, then resources are being pulled and stretched to try to help figure out male advocates, how try to hire male advocates to do these things. Or the male advocates now are doing so many different things at the same time that they're just overworked. And a lot of times men won't want to put that much work in because it's a lot of different things that they have to do in order to receive their salaries. So maybe more funding dispersed out into uh, specific programs that work with specific things, men doing the work for young boys and even men in their work. But again, it would have to and so my next recommendation and the things that we've seen would be that dynamic and relationship, healthy relationship between men and women, between the men doing the work and the women being accountable to women. Sorry, that is a huge thing. That's something that has got us by this far.
Mm-hmm.
Because in our own communities, in our Indian communities, we work with women all the time. There's women like that in the communities all the time who do not trust men. They don't trust us. And for good reason, because every man in their life, or the majority of the men in their lives, have been violent or have given them every reason not to trust them and not to like them or not to want to be their equal. Um, I do not blame women for not trusting us as men, but I do hope and I do want to encourage those women out there that there are better men out there. There are healthy men out there. We're coming along. we're learning, we're growing every day. Every day we're healing. And uh, I don't want to ask women to do anything for us, but time. Time is of the essence, right? And time is something that's very valuable. But time is what is needed to find healing for us, men. And that was uh, two of the biggest issues that we have found in our community is funding and healing for men in our community. Oftentimes, if the community, like if Rosebud didn't support somebody doing something, or if another community didn't support a man doing that type of work, please, that you have to announce to that man that what he's doing wrong, what isn't being supported, how it's taking as offense towards the community, and what's not appropriate. Those things need to be voiced, and not necessarily in a force to control everything all the time and have all that control over. But at the same time, accountability needs to be present and be held by the community and by the community's matriarchs. And if not, then that programming, then the men in that organization, or you just will not get supported, buddy. You have to have the type of relationship that a nephew would with his aunt, that a son would with his mother, or a grandson would to his grandmother. There has to be that type of relationship. And those are some of the recommendations in helping it address the issues of sexual violence against men and boys. And once you can realize and accept those two, or not accept that, or even if you had funding, and then the next thing into finding the trust and the conversation between men and boys is again, not make it about yourself. Remove
So
out of it.
thank you. So one of my questions, because a lot of the coalitions are beginning to do this within their coalitions, but do you think it's important to have like a specific policy as part of your organizations that you are welcoming to individuals, males who identify as two-spirit or gay or bisexual? Is it written in your policies? So for instance, for me who identifies, and I never addressed my own violence or whatever, and I came to your program, and would you create a welcome space for me?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. I do believe that. So here's the bottom line. I don't hate it, I guess. I don't like that there has to be those type of policies to make people behave in a sort of manner that they would towards their own family as and to a complete stranger. And so with that, meaning as a facilitator working with straight men, should automatically, but it's not. This is the thing that I'm talking about. Do not automatically feel or believe or understand the non-straight or the man who is gay. It's something that is wild to me that one wouldn't already believe that they're equal to us. And so yes, the policies do. I do believe that there should be those types of policies in programs and organizations and corporations, and that have an array of different types of people, different genders, and their own sexual orientations. I do believe that should be a policy. That should be an automatic quality behavior. That should be automatic. Being that it isn't, it's just upsetting that people that you see people every day will talk down or belittle somebody who is different than them, and it's really upsetting to see that. And I'm sorry I'm laughing, but it's no laughing matter. And it's just for 2020, and we still believe that there still are people out there who are unsupportive of anybody different than them.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just sad to see that. And so when people do come into our realm or in in our talking circle or our programming. It would all like, man, I would love to have you in our class and to present. Actually, come on, Letty, come on.
Well, maybe after COVID, I would love to come
About.
in. I would love to come in and do that work for you, because I think it's really important, because, you know, we do have individuals out there who are Native, who are closeted, who have experienced violence or have become perpetrators that haven't really addressed their identity. And it's uncomfortable because we're not very accepting in our communities in regards to individuals like me. You know, why do you think we're still fighting to get married within our own tribal communities? You know, being 570 recognized tribes here in the US, and only 30 plus tribes allow same-sex marriage, you know. But one of the things that I always say about, for me as a two-spirit male, as a wink, organization, we were looked upon as being spiritual beings because of the roles that we played in community. And after colonization, and because of colonization, we're looked upon as sexual beings, you know, and we're dehumanized. So as part of my work, that's what I like to address, is the fact that, you know, we need to go to a place where we know that we're welcomed, you know, and that our identity, our sexual orientation has nothing to do with the work that we want to do to heal. And so we have a lot of work to do within our communities, is what I'm saying. So I'm really glad that you agree with that, because we don't have that kind of conversation, right? So what I am going to do, we got about 25 minutes left. So what I'm going to do is that I really appreciate having this conversation with you, Greg. And thank you for the work that you do. And I think it is important that we do get federal funding to help support the work that you're doing, because there's very little organizations that are actually doing male work. And you know, if we want our communities to heal, we need to address all of our genders within our community, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over to Michaela, and I think what we're going to do is open it up for any questions from the audience.
Okay.
Yeah, so for those who are watching on Facebook, please type in your question in the comment section and we'll be sure to pass it along to our panelists here.
You know, in some of my connections with some federal agencies and stuff, one of the things that I keep reminding them is that we need to invite males like you to the table who are doing the actual work, so that they hear about the work that you're doing, you know. Because again, you know, we're always having people telling us how to do our work, but not really truly understanding how we do things as Native people. So again, I just commend you for all the work that you're doing within your community.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And you're right. We were a part of uh, a national men's coalition that was in the beginning stages of growing and getting bigger. And this is when we had the conversation with OVW and trying to create some funding. And they're the ones that told us at that time to go to our local domestic violence shelters. There are other men out there who are, if not already doing the same type of work, there are other men who are very, very interested in doing this type of work as well. And there's a lot of good men out there that I've met who are just waiting for funding, waiting for resources to become or to open up so that way they can apply for them and can create programming in their own communities. And so there's a lot of men out there that I would support and that I would even endorse should that ever come and be a thing and for national community or for national grants and federal grants. There are a lot of men out there that are very good men and are trustworthy.
Yeah, most definitely. I agree with you, because like, you know, when I was down in New Mexico presenting on sexual violence against men and boys, and what I remember the most is the fact that 4 men came forward and acknowledged and disclosed to me that they were sexually abused. But what I remember about it was the sense of relief on their face that someone was talking about it. So again, you know, we have a lot of work to do in our communities, but just spending time with those four men and talking with them has really impacted me enough to, like, you know, this work needs to be done. You know,
Mm.
our men need to heal,
Yep.
you know, but they also need a safe space to heal in.
Yep.
So
You're right in that. It's something different to be put in that position of sharing openly and sharing publicly and things. When we first got into that type of work of sexual assault and even sharing my own personal story of sexual assault, when that first happened, that conversation was happening with women where what else could we do? For we have a bunch of women that are sharing their stories as testimonies, but there's no men in the community that where there's no cohesiveness, there's no working together. And I'm standing there as the nephew in the back of a room and there's a bunch of powerful voices, women voices around the table. And my auntie, she's like, men wouldn't do that. Men wouldn't come out and talk about things that even if it does happen to them. I was like, auntie, if I found a man who would want to share his story, would you let him share? And she said, if you can find one, but that, and then right when she said that, I said, I will. And he's the whole table changed. The whole table changed. And that right there, she's like, then I seen my auntie's face. She realized. Oh. She
mhm,
realized in her eyes and in her heart, she's like, we do need to be more conscious in how we talk about these types of things around anybody, no matter who they are. And geez, then I almost punked myself out when I shared it. I almost backed out. I said, no, I don't, I better not. But my auntie was there, and she's the former executive director of White Buff Cap Woman Society, and it was really supportive. It was really supportive. And you're right, when sharing like that out and open as a man, other men will come forward and share that they were assaulted before in
mhm.
their childhood, or share that they are hurt very similarly in their childhood, and then it creates such a strong bond
Yeah.
because as men we want to help each other all the time. Anyways, we see somebody and automatically we say we have that look. We have that look that we give each other and we're like, I got your back. Or if anything happens, I'll help protect you. Or we're safe together, so we're gonna be okay together.
Yeah.
And I think it's a silent pact that's handshake. Handshake gets through the eyes.
Mm, that's really beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. So we are starting to get some questions rolling in. So our first question is from Angie, and she asks, if our communities don't have someone like Greg, but have men that need healing, do you think it's possible to begin these types of healing circles and organizations in coordination with non-Indigenous health professionals and counselors?
Wow. Um,
Go
so
ahead, Eddie. You want to take
who
that?
who's that question for either one of us?
Yes.
Okay. So one of the things that I've had, because I've had a lot of conversation with Greg in probably the last, what, 6 months to a year in regards to how can we do this work together. One of the things that I think is really important is that me and Greg had conversations about creating a specific training for like our mental health providers, anyone in community that works with individuals who are impacted by sexual violence or domestic violence. So, so the work that I would do is, so based on my work, it's based on like mental health, like the impact on our mental health when you're a survivor of sexual violence, right? So that would be the piece that I would do. And then what I have encouraged Greg to do is to do the other cultural and spiritual aspect. So this training would specifically also be for Native people, but it would also be for non-Native people. because I think it's important that our non-native people understand how to work with our population and really understand that often our own population doesn't trust non-native people, and that's why we don't go to them. But as part of my own healing, and healing from all of my violence, one of the things that I will tell people is that the people who helped me were white, but I had to learn how to trust them. And I had to really want to go through that healing process, even though it was very painful. So my hope is that once we get past this COVID, that I really want to do some national work with Greg, because I really believe it's going to be important. It's very important. We just need to create space for the men in our communities to heal.
Mm.
Greg, did you have anything you wanted to say, or?
No, I mean, I fully support that. I do believe that same way. I understand it the same way of, I do believe non-native programming can help Native men, Native women, but it is tough to trust that they will help you. It
Mm-hmm.
is tough to trust that they will help us. That is really difficult for our people, Indigenous people, to trust non-natives. Why?
Yes.
Because there's so many times, so many instances for so long where we couldn't trust them because they would hurt us more. But I do believe once we figure a trusting relationship, and again, these are things that like it's gotta be that before we can move forward. Okay, let's face it head on and see if we can trust each other. But that has to be an openly shared relationship or an openly shared dynamic.
Yep.
I think, and then yes, and then culturally, you can take and learn things. And but what I think would be the most difficult thing is taking what you've learned and taking what you know and relating those two. Meaning in the middle, taking what you've learned and taking what you know, meaning the culture, like your own indigenous culture, taking something that you don't understand, and how do you make that culture relevant for you and your own community? Because what they believe off reservation is a little different than what we believe on reservation. What
Mm-hmm.
they believe in non-native society, we believe a little different in native society. And so that's the most difficult thing that I found that we've run into. And not just us as Wichita, but just men in general in this type of work is you have to find how it makes sense to you and your own community.
Yep. And survivors should be the experts.
And survivors are the experts. I strongly believe that survivors are the experts. And there are been times that we've seen people who weren't survivors and who are still trying to do the work, but be an ally. And, and I've seen of other victims and survivors of sexual assaults, they bless their heart. They're trying, but, so we gotta find ways to learn each other and become uh, relatives. I guess that would be the way to connect both.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. And, at SBI, that is one thing that we strongly believe, that survivors are the experts. And we always try to center that expertise in all of our work. So the next question comes from Chase, and he asks, in what ways have rigid Western gender norms compromised the health of the Two-Spirit community? And I would add a second onto there, as well as how has it compromised the health of Native men as well?
Well, so in the work that I do, in regards to, I know to Two-Spirit identity, is that one of the things that I say is that I know it's important to address, but one of the things that I don't like in doing this work is that we always have to put this population in a box. And that's why I say I'm a male who was impacted by sexual violence. My identity as a Two-Spirit person should not be part of the conversation. Being sexually violated did not make me Two-Spirit,
Yeah.
and we need to sort of, again, that's where I'm saying we need to check our biases, you know. being sexually abused does not make you gay, and and I will be honest, and a couple months ago I did a webinar for tribal colleges on sexual violence against males in tribal colleges, and that question came up. There was someone who said that they believed, or it was related around the fact that because this male was sexually abused, that's what made him gay. And again, we're still having to educate and bring awareness to our communities about this population. So why do we have to make it about that identity rather than the identity of a male that's impacted? I get it, but I don't like that we have to put this population in a box, because the way that I look at it is like dehumanizing this population. And this just doesn't matter within like this work, but also the work of, like child welfare, we haven't even created a safe space for our young people to come out. So, that's a really deep like conversation to have. But I mean, the Western way of thinking, the colonization has changed how this population is viewed within tribal communities. So I blame it a lot on that historical and intergenerational trauma that has happened to our population. So, but again, I don't want our population to be forgotten in this work, because a lot of us are survivors. So that's my thoughts.
Thank you. Greg, would you like to add anything?
And can you read the original question again?
Yeah, so it asks, in what ways have rigid Western gender norms compromised the health of Native men?
Rigid.
Rigid Western norms. I guess I'll
Gender.
understand that rigid Western norms, but I do believe that
Like you're supposed to be masculine, you're supposed to be this way, you're not supposed to cry, you're not supposed to ask for
I,
help.
I was recently asked a question before about how can non-natives help natives, and that might be maybe a way I'm taking that question there. How can, or how has it affected Native community or Native men? That when I was asked what can the non-Native community do to help Native men or natives in their communities, my answer was to leave us alone. Leave us alone. Let us work that out.
Wow.
Because oftentimes, um, the Western beliefs, and I think I'm starting to understand his rigidness, or him using the word rigid, is a little off, and there's a little less connection to community and values, and it's more about understanding the uh, evidence-based type stuff. It's more about what's proven. This is what the statistics we ran. These are the things that we've done. We've been doing these type of researches for so long. This is what it said. Um, we're a little different than anybody else in the world. I think we're way different than anybody else in the world, let alone this nation, the United States. And it has affected our people because oftentimes in the historical trauma, it goes back to that it was forced. Everything that was Christian, everything that was non-native was forced onto Native people in our communities. And when white folk come into our community and begin to want to teach us as natives, we just feel like we're being belittled the entire time. We feel like we're being judged, or you don't understand. And it's like you're taking a non-survivor to teach survivors something. Survivors of assaults are the professional survivors of the professionals. Whereas if you're going to teach anything to Native people, it should just maybe be a method, and that's it. Don't force it down the throats. And I think a lot of times we get that forced teaching, and it just, our people shut down with it, and we don't pay attention to it. It doesn't help us one bit.
Okay. So there's no more questions, Jessica?
No, there are not any more questions.
Okay. So, Greg, I am going to ask you to spend a few minutes if you have any more things that you would like to share or any words of encouragement. So I'm going to give you a few minutes before we end, if there's anything else that you would like to say.
To our Indigenous people, uh, should you be given the responsibility to help somebody that has been or that is a victim of sexual assault, is a survivor looking to heal, best way to do that is your own culture. I think every Indigenous culture has a form of beliefs, and or virtue. We call them virtues. There's 12 virtues. Some people have 7 virtues. Some people have 4 or 13 virtues. These virtues are all values such as love, courage, trust, respect, honor, fortitude, sacrifice, wisdom. Hey, almost had them up at 8 of the 12. But each and every one of those has 2 separate ways of learning. Now you can take love, for instance. One should learn how to love, right? We should learn how to love, but we should also learn how to receive it. We should learn how to give love and receive love, because that's 2 different things. You can teach somebody to love all you want, and as soon as somebody comes that wants to love them, they ain't gonna know what that looks like. Trust, how to give trust, how to receive it. Courage, how to give courage or bravery, and how to receive that bravery. All these values, you have to learn 2 things: how to give it and how to receive it. If you only teach or you only tell somebody to learn how to get it or to receive it, they won't know how to give it. So we have to learn different ways in our culture. In our culture, as people, because it will fix all of our problems. You just have to understand that there's different ways in that our culture is understood.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you have to take a step back. If you learn a certain way in our culture to help somebody, Lenny might do it a little differently, and that's okay too. But we have to learn how to give and receive each each value. Once we learn that, I think we become better relatives towards each other. We can be better partners for our partners. We can be better brothers. We could be better sisters. We could be better family members and even community members. Be better
Mm-hmm.
neighbors towards each other. And I
Yeah.
think the bottom line is learn to be a good relative. Once you learn to be a good relative, then I think healing and community engagement, and everything will come together very, very well, and it won't be as stressful. It won't be as forced. It won't be as friction. Maybe you won't have as much friction. I think learning to be a better relative will help you understand whenever you have to have the difficult conversations or create the difficult spaces, of a survivor or a victim.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. I just want to do a follow-up to what you're saying too, is because, when we talk about individuals who identify, what really brings to mind in what you were saying was what a Dakota spiritual person said. Um, so there was so 2 spirit people went to his community to seek ceremony and be a part of ceremony. And so I was able to be a part of that conversation along with another 2 spirit person. So because we had planned this to help our people heal or go to a space of healing. One of the things that he said to us was that he had told his community We are going to have two-spirit people come here. And if you don't like it, then you don't need to be here.
Mm.
He said, because this is a place that's sacred. This is a place where all people should come and pray and not be judged because of their identity. So I would love to see that happen in all of our tribal communities, because that's one of the issues that really impacts our community, is that the shun ceremony.
Mm.
And that we played a huge part in ceremony. All two-spirit, Native LGBTQ people, we played a huge part in ceremony, but that's been forgotten. So I think it's really important that as we do this work too, that we don't make that such a huge thing about our identity, but the realization that I'm a male that was impacted by sexual violence, right? And so that's how we should think. We shouldn't think like strictly their identity. Do you know what I mean? Because
Right.
that's not their whole identity. So anyway, I mean, there could be more conversation about that, but that's my own thoughts about that. But Greg, I really appreciate you being a part of this conversation. I'm really glad that you're here, and I just want to thank you for everything that you said today. So I'm going to turn it back over to Michaela.
Thank you, Lenny.
Thank you. Thank you for being here.
All right, so that wraps it up for our webinar series in honor of Domestic Violence Awareness Month. We're so grateful to have had so many really great conversations exploring kind of the different facets of this issue, and really look forward to having more conversations on this issue. So with that, we'll end our webinar for the day, and I hope you all have a great afternoon.
Thank you. Take care.